Like a silver streak across the midnight sky, our stories move with a brilliance and speed that you will never forget. Experience high-octane drama and the thrill of a narrative that never slows down. Hit subscribe now and catch the streak before it disappears into the dark.
The number on my phone screen didn't register at first. I read it 3 times before my brain accepted what my eyes were seeing. $41.17. That was what remained in my business account. The account I'd spent 3 years building. The account that held the $87,000 I'd raised from investors last spring to launch the second phase of my interior design studio. I stood in my childhood bedroom, the one with the water stain on the ceiling shaped like a boot, the one I'd stared at every night growing up, counting down the years until I could leave. And I just stood there, completely still, like someone had removed all the air from the room, and I simply hadn't fallen yet. Downstairs, I could hear my mother laughing. That particular laugh she saves for company, high and bright, nothing like the flat voice she uses with me. My aunt had just told some story about a cruise ship and a lost suitcase, and everyone was in the kitchen finishing the last of the sweet potato pie. We'd just spent the whole weekend together for my grandmother's 80th birthday. 40-some relatives crammed into this house, sleeping on air mattresses, borrowing each other's phone chargers, pretending everything was fine. I had driven 6 hours to be here. I had bought my grandmother a sapphire bracelet she cried over. I had smiled at every single person. And while I was doing all of that, someone had emptied my account. I sat down on the edge of the bed. The mattress springs made that familiar sound, the one I'd forgotten about until this exact moment. I opened the transaction history and scrolled. One transfer. 11 days ago, $86,943. The memo line said, family loan reimbursement. I had never authorized a family loan. I had never been asked. I pressed the heels of my palms against my eyes and breathed. I needed to think clearly. I am not a person who falls apart easily. I learned a long time ago that falling apart is something you can only afford to do when someone safe is around to catch you, and I have never had that luxury in this house. So I breathed. I counted backward from 20. I thought about what I knew. There were only 2 people who had ever had access to that account. I'd added them 3 years ago when the studio was just an idea on a napkin, and I needed co-signers to open the business account in the first place. My credit was thin. I was 28. I was terrified. My mother had insisted she and my stepfather be on the account, just for now, just to get you started. We'll take ourselves off once you're established. I had never made them take themselves off. I had trusted them. I put my phone in my pocket and went downstairs. My mother was at the sink rinsing dishes when I came into the kitchen. My stepfather was at the table with my uncle, talking about some property deal that hadn't gone the way he'd hoped. That was always what he was talking about. Some deal that almost worked. Some investment that was almost good. Some opportunity that someone else had ruined for him. His name is Gerald. I have called him that since I was 12, when I decided I was done pretending. My mother calls him Jerry. Most of the relatives call him by a nickname I won't use because I've spent years trying to scrub it out of my mental vocabulary. He came into our lives when I was 9, took up most of the space in every room, and spent the next decade treating my mother's income like his own personal operating budget. Mom, I said. I kept my voice level. Can I talk to you for a second? She looked over her shoulder. The dishes will wait. Not about dishes. Something shifted in her face. Just slightly. I have studied my mother's face my entire life the way you study a weather map when you live somewhere with bad storms. You learn to read the small changes before the big ones hit. She dried her hands on a dish towel and followed me into the hallway. My business account, I said. I kept my voice low. There's $41 in it. There was $87,000 on Friday. She didn't flinch. That was the thing I wasn't ready for. She just looked at me with this particular expression. Not guilt, not surprise, not even discomfort. Something more like impatience. We needed it, Celeste, she said. Gerald's deal fell through and we were going to lose the house. The bank was not going to wait. I heard the words. I processed them, but some part of my brain kept trying to reject them, the way your body rejects a bad transplant. You took my money, I said, without asking me. You would have said no. Mom, you always say no to us. You've been doing well. You have investors. You have that big studio space. We raised you. We gave up things for you. Is it so unreasonable that when we were in crisis? Yes, I said. It is. That was not your money. That was my investor's money. That was money I am legally obligated to account for." She pursed her lips. "You're so dramatic." I went back into the kitchen. Gerald looked up when I walked in. He had that look he always gets when he knows something is coming, and he's decided to be amused by it rather than afraid. 40 years of getting away with things gives a person a certain brand of confidence. He leaned back in his chair. "You want to talk about the transfer," he said. "Not a question. I want to know who initiated it." "I did." He shrugged. One shoulder. "We had a situation. You had available funds. It's a family loan, Celeste. We'll pay it back." "You will pay it back," I said. "Because I have a fiduciary responsibility to my investors, and I will be taking legal action if that money is not returned within 72 hours. He laughed. Actually laughed. My uncle shifted uncomfortably and studied his coffee cup. My mother appeared in the doorway behind me. "Legal action," Gerald repeated. "Against your own family. Against two people who took $87,000 from a business account without authorization." He shook his head like I'd said something childish. "We needed it more than you did right now. You're young. You can raise more money. You're good at that." And that was it. That was the sentence. "We needed it more than you did," said with the same energy someone might use to explain why they took the last piece of bread. Just simple logic. Just obvious. Just the way things were. I looked at him for a long moment. I thought about every single time I had been in this house and felt exactly like this. Like something that existed to be used. Like a resource, not a person. I thought about the $3,000 my mother had borrowed when I was 24 that she still calls a gift she gave herself. I thought about the college fund my grandmother had set up for me that had somehow been emptied when I was 16 and never explained. I thought about every time I had raised a concern and been told I was dramatic, ungrateful, difficult. "Okay," I said quietly. I went upstairs, packed my bag, and said goodbye to my grandmother. I kissed her cheek. I told her the bracelet looked beautiful on her. All of that was real. None of that was performance. Then I got in my car and drove 2 hours to the nearest city where my attorney had her office, called her from the parking garage of a hotel, and started building the case that would cost Gerald and my mother everything they thought they'd secured. Her name is Patricia, and she has been my attorney for 4 years. I met her at a small business workshop when I was 27, just starting out, and she'd handed me her card and said, "You look like someone who's going to need a lawyer someday." I'd laughed. She hadn't. She answered on the second ring even though it was Sunday evening. I told her everything. She was quiet through most of it, asking specific questions at specific moments. "When did you add them to the account? Were there any written agreements? Have you been in contact with your investors about this?" By the end, she said, "Don't transfer anything. Don't send any messages. Don't discuss this with any family members. I'll be in the office at 7 tomorrow." I sat in that hotel room that night and did not sleep much. What I did instead was document everything I could remember. I wrote down dates. Every time I had been asked for money, every time money had moved in ways that felt wrong, every conversation I could recall. I pulled 3 years of bank statements I had stored in cloud backup. I found the original account opening documents where my mother and Gerald had signed as co-signers and reviewed exactly what legal authority that gave them and what it didn't. It did not give them the authority to initiate a transfer of that size to a personal account with no documentation. What it gave my attorney was a starting point. Patricia filed the complaint on a Tuesday. She also sent a formal demand letter to both of them simultaneously, which I was told resulted in a significant argument between my mother and Gerald, because apparently my mother had genuinely not known the full extent of what Gerald had planned. She thought it was a few $1,000s. She hadn't known about the entire $87,000. That information did not move me much, because she'd still stood in that hallway and defended it, but I noted it. The next 3 weeks were some of the hardest I have experienced. My investors had to be told. I had 3 of them, all people who had believed in my work, and sitting across from each of them and explaining what had happened was one of the most humbling things I've ever done. 2 of them were angry, not at me, but the way anger looks the same, regardless of who it's aimed at. The third one, a woman who had built her own business from nothing in her 50s, just looked at me steadily and said, "This isn't the first time someone's had their money stolen by family. It won't be the last. What matters is what happens next." What happened next was that Patricia was very, very good at her job. The bank flagged the transfer immediately once we submitted the complaint. It turned out this was not the first time Gerald had moved funds in ways that attracted scrutiny. There was a pattern, not with my account specifically, but with other accounts. other situations, a prior complaint that had been dropped years before I was even in the picture. Once that pattern was part of the record, the investigation expanded. My mother and Gerald retained their own attorney. I know this because mine told me. I also know they retained a relatively inexpensive one, which told me something about the state of their finances after the mortgage situation they'd supposedly needed $87,000 to solve. I want to be honest about what that period felt like, because I think people sometimes imagine revenge as something that feels clean and satisfying in real time. It didn't. It felt exhausting and sad, and sometimes I would be in the middle of answering a question for my attorney or reviewing a document, and I would just suddenly feel very tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. Tired of all of it. Tired of having to fight people who were supposed to be in my corner. Tired of being the person who always had to build the case because no one was going to build it for them. I called my grandmother twice during those weeks. She knew something was happening. She's 80, not unaware, but she didn't push. She just talked to me about the garden she was trying to start in her backyard, about a book she was reading, about the neighbor who had gotten a very loud dog. It helped more than I can explain. Gerald was charged with unauthorized electronic funds transfer and financial elder abuse. The elder abuse charge came out of the expanded investigation, which revealed he had been drawing from a joint account he shared with my grandmother as her self-appointed financial manager. My grandmother had not known. When she was told, she was the one who insisted on pressing charges. 80 years old, sitting in a lawyer's office, straightening her back and saying, "No, he doesn't get to do that." I have never loved her more than I did at that moment. My mother was not charged criminally, but she was named in the civil suit. She had signed documents. She had defended the transfer to my face. She had not initiated it, but she had known about it and done nothing. The civil judgment came 4 months after I filed the complaint. Gerald and my mother were ordered to repay $87,000 in full plus interest and legal fees. To do that, they had to liquidate. The house they had been so desperate to save, they lost anyway. I did not orchestrate that specifically. It was simply the math. Gerald also entered a diversion program in lieu of criminal sentencing, which meant monitored probation, mandatory financial counseling, and a permanent record of the charges. My mother spent 6 months not speaking to me. Several relatives chose sides, which I had expected. My aunt, my mother's younger sister, who had been at that birthday party, called me 3 weeks into the process and said, "I know what he's been doing for years. I'm sorry no one stopped it sooner." She was the first family member who said my name with any warmth during that whole period. I want to be precise about the outcome. I did not get satisfaction, exactly. I got resolution. Those are different. Satisfaction would have required the other person to understand what they'd done, to feel genuinely what they'd cost me, and I don't believe either Gerald or my mother fully got there. What I got was my money back. What I got was a legal record that would make it harder for Gerald to do this to anyone else. What I got was the ability to go back to my investors and show them, documented and complete, exactly what had happened and exactly how I'd handled it. 2 of them increased their investment after the case closed. The third bought a piece from my spring collection and sent a card that said, simply, "We're still in." I relaunched the second phase of the studio 14 months after the money was taken. The opening was small, 30 people, a converted warehouse space I'd been slowly furnishing for the better part of a year, a playlist I'd been building since before any of this happened. My aunt came. She brought her daughter, who turned out to be genuinely talented and interested in design, and who now interns with me 2 days a week. My grandmother came too. She arrived early, walked through every room slowly, touching things gently. A lamp, the edge of a credenza, the fabric on a chair I'd reupholstered myself. She stopped in front of a watercolor I'd hung near the entrance, one I'd made during one of the harder weeks, just to have something to do with my hands. "This is yours?" she asked. "Yes." She nodded. "You should make more of those." I have thought about forgiveness. I think about it more carefully than people might expect, because I understand that forgiveness is something you do for yourself, not for the other person. I am not angry anymore. Anger is expensive, and I have a business to run. But forgiveness, in the sense of returning to a relationship as if nothing has changed, as if the people involved have changed, that's a different thing. That requires evidence. I haven't seen it. My mother sent me a text on my birthday, 3 months after the case closed. It said, "I hope you have a good day." I read it several times. I thought about what I would want it to mean and what it actually meant, and whether those two things would ever be the same. Then I put my phone down and went back to the proposal I was drafting for a new client, a young woman, early 30s, opening her first space. She'd shown me a photo of her grandmother's kitchen and said, "I want it to feel like this, like somewhere that belongs to someone." "I can do that," I told her, and I meant it completely. People ask me sometimes, now that I've talked openly about what happened, now that it's part of my story in a way I've made peace with, they ask what I would have done differently. The honest answer is, I would have removed them from that account the moment I was established enough not to need the co-signers anymore. I knew, somewhere, that I should. I had the thought and I let it pass because acting on it would have required a conversation I wasn't ready to have. I chose discomfort later over discomfort now, and discomfort later cost me 4 months of my life and nearly my investors' trust. What I try to tell people who are in early stages of their own situations, people who recognize something in this story, who are sitting with their own version of that sick feeling in a childhood bedroom with their phone in their hand, is this: your instincts are usually right. The reason you haven't acted on them is almost never that you were wrong. It's that acting requires facing something you've been managing by not looking at it directly. I'm not saying what I did was easy. I'm saying it was survivable. I'm saying I'm still here, still working, still building something that is entirely mine. I'm saying that the people who bet on me, the ones who saw what happened and stayed, turned out to be enough. They were more than enough, actually. The watercolor my grandmother admired at the opening is still hanging near the entrance of the studio. I painted it in November, during the worst week of the legal process, at 2 a.m. because I couldn't sleep. It's not technically accomplished. The proportions are a little off. The color is murkier than I intended. But there's something in it that I still recognize. Something that looks like someone deciding quietly, in the dark, that they are not going to let this be the end of the story. I think about that version of me sometimes, sitting at the kitchen table with a brush and a jar of water and nothing in her account and everything still ahead of her. I'd like to tell her it works out. I think she already knew. I have thought a lot about what it actually means when someone who was supposed to protect you decides instead to take from you. Not just the money, though the money was real and the damage was real and the months of rebuilding were exhausting in ways I still feel in my body sometimes. I mean the taking in a broader sense. The quiet, accumulated assumption that what I had built was available to them, that my discipline was their cushion, that my sacrifice was their safety net. Gerald didn't steal from me because he was desperate. People who are genuinely desperate ask. They sit across from you and they tell you the truth and they let you decide. What Gerald did was calculate. He looked at what I had worked for and decided, without a word to me, that his claim on it was stronger than mine. That is not desperation. That is a particular kind of arrogance. The kind that has gone unchallenged long enough to mistake itself for logic. And the thing about that kind of arrogance is that it rarely starts with the person sitting across from you. It starts earlier. It starts with small things that were allowed to pass. Every time someone in my life took without asking and faced no real consequence, the next taking became easier to justify. My grandmother's account. My mother's borrowed thousands that became a gift she gave herself. My college fund that disappeared when I was 16 with no explanation anyone ever bothered to give me. Each of those was a lesson Gerald and my mother were teaching themselves, that I was someone from whom things could be taken. What changed was not them. What changed was me. Not in a dramatic way. Not in the way people sometimes imagine. Some single moment of clarity, some speech, some door slamming. It was quieter than that. It was me sitting in a hotel room at 11 at night with a yellow legal pad and writing down everything I remembered, every date, every amount, every conversation, because I finally understood that no one was going to build this case except me. That understanding was not bitter. It was just true, the way a lot of useful things are true. Plain and a little cold and ultimately clarifying. The outcome followed from the actions, the way outcomes usually do when you give them enough time and documentation. Gerald's pattern caught up with him not because the universe intervened, but because patterns leave records. Every financial decision he'd made across years had a paper trail, and once someone started looking, the trail told a complete story. My mother's willingness to stand in that hallway and defend what he'd done meant she was part of that story, whether she'd understood the full scope or not. Consequences, when they finally came, were proportional to choices. not to how much anyone felt sorry, not to family loyalty, not to how many years they'd known me. I think about Celeste at 28 sometimes, the one who opened that account with cosigners because she was scared and didn't know yet how strong she actually was. I want to tell her the fear was reasonable, but you can learn to act anyway. The instinct that told you something wasn't right, that instinct was correct. What you practice is being willing to act on it even when acting is uncomfortable, even when the people who will be affected are people whose opinion of you still matters more than it should. Integrity is not a feeling. It is a habit. It is what you do with the legal pad at 11 at night when no one is watching and everything is still uncertain. And resilience is not the absence of exhaustion. It is continuing to write, continuing to build, continuing to show up for the people who actually showed up for you, even when you are tired. My grandmother came to the reopening. She walked through every room slowly. She touched the edge of a chair I'd reupholstered myself and nodded like something had been confirmed for her. That nod meant more to me than the judgment or the repayment or any of it. It meant, I see what you made. I see that you are still here. That is enough. It has always been enough. We just sometimes have to fight our way back to knowing it.